So on our channel, we've done a lot of comparisons with medium format cameras, predominantly against full frame systems. But what we haven't done is compare cameras like the GFX 100, which is about a 10K camera, versus the proper medium format systems like the Hasselblad H6D 400C. So this is the one with the pixel shift features, and it can produce 400 megapixel files, and the sensor in this camera is significantly larger than the GFX, and we thought it's about time we compared the two. So what in Leeds, we're going to test a few things out between both cameras and see how they compare with one another. Okay, so let's run through some of the specifications between both of these camera systems. We're not going to go through all of them, we're just going to be talking about some of the key differences. For instance, even though both of these cameras have 100 megapixels in terms of resolution, the sensor sizes are different. So the Hasselblad sensor is quite a bit larger, and because of that, the field of view is going to be different. For example, if you're shooting with a 120 macro lens on the Hasselblad, the field of view is similar to like a 75mm on a full frame system, whereas on the GFX is something like a 95mm lens. So although the resolution is the same, field of view is quite a bit different. The other thing is, this is a DSLR camera, so it is huge. The flange distance is huge. It's got an OVF, which is a brilliant OVF, but it is an OVF, whereas the GFX, it's a mirrorless camera. Much slimmer in design, it's much smaller, it's much lighter in comparison to the Hasselblad camera, and also the EVF in this camera does have a few advantages over the OVF. Finally, this camera system has a much better autofocus system. It is significantly better than the one in the Hasselblad. This is still using a relatively old autofocus system, whereas the GFX, it is using a more modern phase detect autofocus system. So it has features like eye detect, phase detect, and those features really do come in handy. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take some pictures with both of these camera systems, and we're going to look at some of the image quality. We're going to test out some of the we've got two lenses. We've got the 120 macro and the 45mm for the GFX, and the 120 and the 50mm for the Hasselblad. So we're going to compare both systems and see how they perform. So the biggest difference between both of these cameras is the speed and autofocus. The GFX is just a world beyond the Hasselblad when it comes to autofocus. I've got far more shots in focus with the GFX than I can with the Hasselblad, and it makes a huge difference because those subtle movements between poses, I can capture them more effectively with the GFX than I can with the Hasselblad. With the Hasselblad, honestly, the autofocus is extremely unreliable. 9 times out of 10 it's going to be out of focus, so I just resorted to using manual focus because that was the only way that I was able to get a net in focus. Honestly, it was the only way. And the other issue is that the speed, every time you take a shot with the Hasselblad, there's just this delay that you have to wait, and it really does take you out of the scene. It kind of takes you out of the moment. So the GFX is just much better in that regard. It keeps you in the zone. You're able to shoot more effectively. You're able to get more shots in focus. You've got a wider selection, and you've got better options available with the GFX. Having said that, the field of view differences does make a big difference, because with the 120 on the Hasselblad, you've got more flexibility when it comes to your working distance. You can step in closer to get a tighter crop, but that tighter crop is still going to be relatively wider in terms of the field of view compared to the GFX, so you can produce a shallower depth of field, and you've just got more flexibility in that regard, and I find it to be better because of that. The other thing is, and this might not be a fair point to make at this stage, but when we're looking at the images on the back of the screen on the Hasselblad, they do tend to look a little bit better. The depth of field differences, the that wider field of view when you're shooting from the same distance, and also the colors, like the colors from the GFX just look a little bit muted in comparison to the Hasselblad. Hasselblad as a camera system or as a company, they've done colors far better than many other manufacturers, and the H6D does an incredible job when it comes to color. However, it's not really a fair point to make at this point, because we are looking at the back of the screens, and the screens on cameras tend not to be good indicators when it comes to image quality or colors. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hop into Lightroom. We're going to be using, you know, proprietary software, but then comparing both of them in Lightroom just to see the image quality differences. We're going to be taking a number of control tests, and we're also going to be comparing the pixel shift features between both of these cameras to see which ones are better. So let's jump into Lightroom and do a more controlled comparison. So here we have a bunch of images opened up in Lightroom, but don't worry, none of the files were processed in Lightroom. The Hasselblad files were processed in Focus and then brought into Lightroom as TIFF files, and the Fuji files were processed in Capture One and brought into Lightroom as TIFF files. So we're only using Lightroom to put these final, you know, processed TIFF files side by side so we can do this comparison. And the first couple of images, these were just test shots that we took to demonstrate a couple of things. First thing is the field of view. So even though the 50mm is a longer focal length than the 45mm, the larger sensor means that it has a much wider field of view in comparison to the Fuji. And you can see how the Hasselblad is able to capture more in the frame in comparison to the Fuji. That's not an advantage or a disadvantage, it's just, you know, the field of view depends on how you prefer to work and so on and so forth. It's just what it is in terms of the field of view. The focal length isn't going to give you the same look because of the difference in sensor size. Color-wise, I think Hasselblad is doing a little bit better. It's a little bit more neutral, but some people may not like that because it does look a little bit flatter. The Fuji, sorry, looks a little bit more vibrant, but it has this magenta shift to it, which I'm not really a fan of. So, you know, it depends on what color profile you use. I think Provia leans really heavily into the magentas, but it is the standard profile. Astia tends to do a better job in general. However, Astia does boost the greens quite heavily, so it does look a little bit unnatural in some instances. But I think Astia tends to look a little bit better. Having said that, I think both cameras do a good job, but color-wise, I think Hasselblad, it's just one of the strengths of Hasselblad cameras. The other thing to notice is that the Hasselblad lens is noticeably sharper. So even with the wider field of view, it's picking up more detail from Annette's face. The 45mm from Fujifilm, it's one of the, if not the softest lenses for the GFX series of cameras. The other lenses for the GFX series of cameras are significantly sharper. I think this lens is just one of those lenses which is not that sharp. You can see that it is in focus. I mean, obviously, this has a much better focus system in comparison to the Hasselblad. So if any of the images are not going to be in focus, it's probably going to be the Hasselblad. But the Fuji lens, it's just softer. I've tested it several times. In almost every scenario, it is quite soft, wide open. For the second comparison, we're looking at the 120mm macro wide open. And in this instance, we use the Astia profile. And you can see how it actually looks a lot better when it comes to the overall feel of the image. The colors look nicer in the Astia profile than it does with the standard Provia profile. However, the greens get boosted quite heavily, which can look nice, especially in this particular scene. I think the Fuji looks better than the Hasselblad for once, but you know, the Hasselblad still looks good. Again, field of view differences, same focal length, but you can see that the Fujifilm is it's cropped in a little bit closer in comparison to the Hasselblad. The Hasselblad has a wider field of view. It's got a little bit more breathing room around the subject. If you zoom in 1:1, you can see that both lenses are very, very sharp. However, the 120 macro from the Fuji camera, it's noticeably sharper. It's picking up a great deal more detail. I mean, it is obviously cropped in, so it does have the advantage in that regard. However, it is a sharper lens overall as well. Even in more controlled tests that I'm going to show you further into this video, you'll notice that the 120 macro from Fujifilm wide open is one of the sharpest macro lenses you'll ever be able to get. It's ridiculously sharp. So regardless of any advantages in terms of field of view, the Fuji lens is sharper. I like the Hasselblad image though. I think a lot of people may like the Hasselblad image because although it's not quite as sharp, it does have quite a nice look. It doesn't look harsh, but we are shooting in harsh sunlight, so that's not really something negative you know, it's not a negative point for the Fuji, but still in the same scenario, in the same harsh sunlight, I think that the Hasselblad image just has a nicer kind of look in terms of that softness, but that does come down to personal preference. Some people prefer a sharp image that they can work with. Some people just like an image that has a slightly less harsh look, like it doesn't look ridiculously sharp and harsh. Like you can see how over here it just looks a little jagged, but that's not a fault, it's just how sharp it is. Third comparison, we use the Astia profile for the Fujifilm image as well, but it does have that magenta shift to it, and the greens are kind of getting boosted a little bit as well. However, overall, this does look really, really good. Field of view differences once again, and obviously the Fuji lens is much sharper, and the focus system on the Fuji system is just incredible. Like, it just nails focus every single time. So regardless of how good the colors are on the Hasselblad, if it misses focus, it misses focus. That's just a problem, and this is something that I had to contend with the Hasselblad in almost every scenario. I just found it to be a bit of a problem with the Hasselblad camera. Having said that, color-wise, I think that in this particular scene, the Hasselblad is doing a much better job. It looks a lot better. Again, Hasselblad tends to aim for a more neutral look, a little bit more commercially kind of viable look, and Fujifilm tends to go for a more stylized look in terms of its images. Comes down to your own preferences. I prefer the Hasselblad. I think that it's a little bit easier to manage and a little bit easier to work with. However, some people may prefer the Fujifilm because the colors do look a little bit more vibrant, but I don't like that that magenta kind of, odd colors in the skin tones, and that's something that I'm not a fan of. Hasselblad, they're known for producing incredible skin tones. Fujifilm, it's not really one of their strong suits in my opinion, but some of you may disagree with that. Finally, here is a portrait that I took of my daughter with both cameras, Fujifilm on the right over here, Hasselblad on the left. And this point that I'm about to make is entirely subjective, and you should take this with a big chunk of salt. But in my opinion, I find that Hasselblad files are a lot easier to edit and manage, and they end up looking better than the Fuji. I think Fuji tends to have a little bit harsher look, and it's a little bit trickier to edit in my opinion, and the colors tend to kind of they don't work quite as well as Hasselblad. I mean, just look at the skin tones over here, and the color. Obviously these have been edited to taste, but I just find it's a lot easier to manage files from the Hasselblad than it is to manage files from the Fuji. Once again, entirely subjective point. Please take this with a massive pinch of salt, but I do find Hasselblad overall tends to be a lot easier to work with, and you end up with better results in my view. I also performed a number of more control tests between both cameras with control lighting, and this first comparison, both shot at the base ISO. This is a dynamic range test. Both images have been underexposed by about 5 stops and then recovered in post, and you can see how the Hasselblad looks a little bit more washed out. The Fujifilm looks quite a bit more contrastier, and when we zoom in 1:1, you could see noise, or a little bit of noise, in both files, but I think the Fujifilm tends to do a little bit better in terms of retaining some of that detail. But then again, the Fuji lens is also a lot sharper. You can see how there's some noise creeping in, but it's actually really, really good. Both cameras are doing an incredible job when it comes to dynamic range. 5 stops of recovery, and it's still doing a fantastic job on both sides. Moving on to the high ISO test, personally, I like the colors from the Hasselblad. I think it just does a brilliant job. Like, it's way more accurate in comparison to Fuji. Fuji does look quite a bit more contrasty, but if you're shooting at 12,800, zooming in 1:1 into the shadow areas, you can see both cameras kind of exhibit a similar amount of noise. However, the Fuji does have a lot of hot pixels coming into the image. So I'm not certain if that's a fault in the actual camera or if that's just an issue with shooting at high ISO. But the Hasselblad doesn't have those hot pixels. But they're not that difficult to get rid of. A little bit of clone stamp, and that's fairly easy to get rid of. However, in terms of overall noise, they're very, very similar. I think Hasselblad is losing a little bit more detail in comparison to the Fuji. However, the overall look in terms of color and so on, Hasselblad is doing a better job in that regard. And then we've got the sharpness tests in a controlled scenario. So These have been white balanced correctly with the color checker, and I think the Hasselblad does a better job. I just think when it comes to color, Hasselblad does a better job overall. You can see how the skin tones on everything over here, it just looks a little bit better. Fuji, brilliant job by the way, but just not quite as good as Hasselblad when it comes to the color. And if we zoom in 1:1, the 120 macro wide open, yeah, the Fuji is clearly the winner. It's a much sharper lens, wide open. I mean, it's ridiculously sharp. This is probably the sharpest macro lens I have ever shot with. There's just no way. Like, this is definitely in focus. You can see it's in focus over here. But the Fuji lens is just incredibly sharp. The thing is, the Fuji lens wide open is so ridiculously sharp that there's no real room for improvement from this point. So when you stop down to f5.6, it gets marginally sharper. However, when you get to about f8, the Fuji lens actually gets a little bit softer because it's so unbelievably sharp wide open that there's nowhere else to go from that point. That's not a bad thing. I'm just pointing out how sharp this lens is. Like, it's just ridiculously sharp. Stopping down to equivalent apertures, so f11 on the Hasselblad, f8 on the Fuji. And yeah, you know, the Fuji is still much sharper. The Hasselblad does sharpen up quite a lot when you stop down. The Fujifilm at f8 is actually slightly softer in comparison to what it is wide open. However, it's still noticeably sharper than the Hasselblad when you stop down to f8 and f11. So depth of field differences are very similar considering the working distance. But yeah, the Fuji is definitely, the macro lens from Fuji is an incredibly sharp lens. It's just ridiculously sharp. The 45mm and the 50mm, however, slightly different results. The 45mm is one of the softest lenses from Fujifilm. So you can see wide open, it's noticeably softer than the Hasselblad lens. And, you know, if we move to the corners over here to the text, you can see it's definitely in focus. You know, the focus system on the Fuji, significantly better than the Hasselblad. And we took a whole bunch of shots with the Fuji just to make sure that we weren't missing focus and we weren't making any mistakes. And yeah, this is the result. It's quite a bit softer in comparison to the Hasselblad. It's a lot softer than a lot of lenses. In fact, this is softer than some old lenses like the 45 tilt shift from Canon. So it's, you know, it's a good lens. It's just not very good when it comes to detail capturing ability wide open. Having said that, when you stop down the 45mm lens, so when you move to about f4, the 45mm lens sharpens up really, really well, like beyond the 50mm. And at f11, yeah, it's clearly the winner between the two. So I think the 45mm wide open is definitely the softest lens available from from Fujifilm. However, as soon as you stop down, even by one stop, it becomes a lot sharper, and then at f11 it's just ridiculously sharp, especially compared to the Hasselblad lens. Finally, we have the 2 pixel shift files, and this is an area where the Hasselblad is just unbeatable. I'm going to make a full video comparing this particular feature in more detail, but we're just going to cover this quickly. We've got the 400 megapixel file on the right over here from the Fuji and 400 megapixel from the Hasselblad over here. First of all, colors, Hasselblad is doing a much better job. So even without any interpolation, Hasselblad does a better job in terms of color. Like the blue tones over here, you can see how the Fuji isn't able to pick out the blue tones as effectively. The color of the cigar, you know, the Fuji's leaning a little bit into the magenta tones, the leather. Basically, in every area, the Hasselblad is doing a better job. And detail with the Hasselblad is just ridiculous. Now, these are big files, so it might take a minute or so for it to load correctly, so I apologize for that. But, you know, there's just no contest. Hasselblad, with its pixel shift features, is insanely good in comparison to the Fuji. You can clearly see, I mean, this is a much sharper lens, by the way. You know, at f11, it is definitely sharper than the Hasselblad. There's no contest in terms of sharpness. However, as soon as you start using the pixel shift features on both camera systems, there's just no way that the Fujifilm can compete. The Hasselblad is in a different league, and this is what separates this camera from basically every other camera system that uses this. Like, this is a very niche camera system. It's a very expensive camera system, and this is the feature of this camera. The pixel shift features is what makes the Hasselblad H6D 400C what it is. and it just has it's just ridiculously good. Everywhere you look, the Hasselblad picks out more detail. It has better color rendition. It is better in almost every regard. Now I'm going to do a more detailed video on this particular feature because I think it's worth covering more effectively. But in this one, we're just going to have a look at the actual files so you can see the differences and see how good the Hasselblad pixel shift results are in comparison to Fujifilm. So, conclusions. Now, this video is already pretty long, so I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible, but quick thing, don't take this too seriously. It is a comparison done out of curiosity and for fun. Nothing more. However, in terms of conclusions, yeah, the GFX 100 is probably the best medium format system on the market. It beats the Hasselblad in pretty much every category except for two areas. Pixel shift, because the Hasselblad, different league. It's a no contest. There's no way the GFX can compete in that area. It's just unbelievably good. And I'm going to be making a video about that specifically, which will either go up before this or after this. I haven't really decided, but it's going to be a separate video discussing and looking at that particular feature in more detail. And the second area is colors. Colors are an area where the GFX really falls short because it's using APS-C or using film profiles that were designed for its APS-C sensor, and they've just kind of ported it across onto their high-end commercial camera, which doesn't really fit because, you know, this is a commercial grade high-end camera used for high-end work, but it doesn't have the color profiles to match. And you know, you might disagree with that, but it's not really something you can dispute because when you put the GFX against a commercial grade camera designed for that kind of work, the Hasselblad, it falls short. It really does. It's very apparent. It's very clear. It's not something you can really disagree with. I mean, Hasselblad knows what they're talking about when it comes to color. They know what they're doing. They've been producing commercial grade color profiles for a long time. That's what they do. That's the kind of camera system they produce. They know color. The GFX, still kind of like, I mean, it feels like Instagram filters on the images. Like, I know that seems really flippant and, you know, very reductionist, but it feels like that to me. It feels like it's got this enormous potential, and Fujifilm put this Instagram filter above it, and I really don't like it. Great for street photography or just casual stuff, but if you're shooting high-end commercial stuff, it doesn't really work. And you know, some of you may run with that one minor critique that I've made against the Fujifilm and ignore all the compliments that I've made. Don't do that, because clearly I think that the GFX 100 is a brilliant camera. I mean, it's basically 10 times less the price compared to the Hasselblad, and it's producing incredible results. Sharpness, better. Low light performance, about the same. Dynamic range, about the same. I mean, with a smaller sensor, it's able to produce incredible results compared to this ridiculously expensive camera system. So yeah, hats off to Fujifilm for producing something magically incredible. But please, produce a color profile for the GFX series of cameras that's going to be suitable for commercial work. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.